All right, so now that we've gotten that all done and set to go, we're gonna get started. Again, just to show you all, we're gonna be asking you for participation throughout the webinar. So you're gonna see on your screen that if you have a laptop or a desktop, there's clicking chat in the meeting controls, and then writing to everyone will work for that. And then if you have a mobile device, you should be able to tap the screen and make the controls appear, click on participants, and then click on chat, and then you should be able to participate in that way. Again, if folks have questions, then feel free to send them to the chat box too. All right. So our objectives for today, to get us started, we are asking that participants will be able to name and define key concepts of community organizing at this presentation, identify community organizing as a primary prevention strategy, identify everyone's role as a community organizer, so asking participants to really think about what their role has been in community organizing so far and what their role can look like going forward. Identify the importance of intentionality in community organizing and prevention work. So I just wanted to get some community knowledge from everyone first to start us off. And so if folks can answer in the everyone chat box, what does community organizing mean to you? And I'll wait to see a couple of answers. And this can be anything from your own personal experiences with community organizing, folks that you might look up to, that are community organizers in your life, just any sort of meaning that it may have to you. And if folks can just put that into the group chat box, that'd be great. Awesome, thank you. So bringing awareness on social justice issues and bringing trauma-informed care to different fields in the community. That's great. Maybe a couple more and then we'll bring together. Okay, from Nicole we have joining together with other individuals or organizations to achieve a common goal and purpose. Awesome. Oh, and from CHH to everyone, identifying communities to facilitate effective organizing and being intentional on who we define community. Yeah, definitely. Awesome. So we're going to move into what we've kind of identified as the essential concepts. A lot of folks talk about community organizing in a lot of different ways, right? And so sometimes we'll hear things like community outreach and education, community organizing, community engagement, community mobilizing, community accountability. I'm sure that we've seen those in a lot of different places, right? And also we're going to be concentrating on community organizing today. Although all of these different types of ways of engaging with community or working with community are very, very awesome and great ways to be doing work, we wanted to talk specifically about community organizing. I'm just going to go through really quickly and define all of those terms so that folks are able to kind of follow through. You should have received an email with a couple handouts and also this PowerPoint to follow along. One of the handouts is titled The Essential Concepts, and this is where the definitions will be if folks want to follow along while I read them out. So community outreach and education, we'll start with the first one. Usually raises community awareness about the issue of gender-based violence and anti-violence resources. And so an example of this is if folks go out in their outreach that they do at their different organizations, usually that'll look like tabling and sitting and really engaging with folks in that way. Then we have community engagement, the process of working collaboratively with and through groups of people affiliated by geographic proximity, special interest, or similar situations to address issues affecting the well-being of people. So that's a CDC definition. And one of the ways that we differentiate that from the other ones is that, you know, such as like White Ribbon Day, and when organizations will engage their community to raise the flag together, that is what we would consider to be community engagement. And then community mobilization, it aims for the active community participation and engagement supporting the anti-violence organization or addressing the problem of gender-based violence. So folks might be familiar with Take Back the Night. That's a really good example of what community mobilization can look like. Also things like the Women's March, where you really gather folks to talk about a certain centered topic around what you want to mobilize a huge community around. And then community accountability, right? It develops the capacity of community members to support survivors and hold abusers accountable for their violence. If folks are familiar, there are some Native communities that have in the past had circle processes where they would sit down and have the community gather when an act of violence would happen and have a conversation about what's going to happen, centered around the survivor of the violence and everybody kind of taking accountability for the fact that that act of violence had happened in the community. And so that's another form of an essential concept of community organizing. So when we go into talking about what is community organizing, right, the big CO, it involves longer-term strategies meant to increase sustained community-based capacity to address gender-based violence. And so all of these definitions that we're offering you all is defined in the lens of gender-based violence. Some of the central ingredients to doing community organizing is to create space for empowerment, allowing folks to be able to empower themselves, right? Building really strong relationships with folks within the community, and creating action for social change.
I think if you don't mind me adding here,
yeah,
really quick, you know, there are many different definitions around community organizing that are just as legitimate as many other, as the definition that we're presenting here. But for the work that we're doing around sexual assault and domestic violence, this is the definition that we're going to be using. Again, not to minimize the definition from, if you don't mind muting yourselves from those who just came in and joined us, please. So not to minimize any other definitions and the historical work that other communities have been doing around community organizing.
Definitely. Thank you. Thanks for adding that in. Yeah, so like Deanna was saying, you know, there have been many different forms of community organizing that have existed. Some have been recorded, some have not been recorded for many different reasons, right? And when we were forming this presentation, we really wanted to root ourselves in understanding what the history of community organizing has been within the United States. A lot of folks, if folks have heard of Alinsky, he's often termed to be the father of community organizing. He wrote a book that was called Rules for Radicals, and it was about community organizing and like the theory of community organizing. There are a lot of critiques about his methods of community organizing. For instance, folks have said that it's often not representative of talking about working with people of color communities or working specifically with women and mobilizing women to be a part of community organizing, because oftentimes he would concentrate on short-term goals. What are the easy wins? And also was concentrating on a locality, whereas folks like Gary Delgado, who is a person who critiqued his work, was saying that oftentimes communities of color or different communities that are marginalized communities may not be able to organize around a locality, but need to organize more vastly across communities that are not just to locality, right? And so we kind of went back and we looked into some more of the critiques, and folks also said that Alinsky, it seemed like a lot of the stuff that he was writing down was actually not given credit to the places where he had learned it. For example, we have 1758 Black churches and religious meetings, wherein folks would meet together and create resistance and strategize together in those ways. And that was like a very great example of community organizing, where folks who were a part of a marginalized group and were dealing with really vast oppression were able to meet together and decide what to do. Also in 1880, which was before Lindsay's time as well, there was neighborhood organizing during industrialization. And when folks were finding themselves in really siloed communities, because a lot of new immigration was coming in and folks were also facing massive industrialization at the same time, people were looking for ways to be able to gather around citizenship and also around community. And so things like settlement housing, things like community centers started to exist around 1880. And folks can look to more of that inside of the sheet that we sent out as well, which is titled Community Organizing History. I also wanted to mention that, when we're looking at the history of community organizing, oftentimes we see that the people who've been able to record different forms of community organizing have been folks who are white, cisgender, heterosexual men who've had access to those institutions to be able to be seen as legitimate theories of community organizing. So in order to delineate the history of community organizing and kind of showcase the fact that marginalized communities have been doing this work forever, right? I wanted to also bring up some examples of different marginalized communities that have worked within their communities, with their communities, and doing work by the communities, right? So folks are probably familiar with the Combahee River Collective. They're a group of Black feminist women who came together and really centered and highlighted the fact that the white feminist movement was not doing work that was representative of all women of color. And then to the right, the top right-hand corner, you'll see Women for Genuine Security. This is a coalition across the world where folks are gathering to talk about ecofeminism and also talking about reproductive justice in that way, in terms of how folks have been affected by globalization, have been affected by militarization in different places, and making sure that people are able to get their needs met and also aren't met by more violence, right? And then STAR, which was created by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. It was in response to the fact that a lot of the organizations that were around at that time, this was in 1969, were not serving the needs of youth who were homeless or youth who were trans, and they found that they needed to be able to gather together to be able to make that a resource. And I really believe that because of the community knowledge that they held, they were able to do that in a really awesome way and a really healing way, and a way that wasn't causing more violence onto the people who are already receiving violence into their lives. And so when we look at the history of community organizing, I think it can't be really seen in a linear way because a lot of things haven't been recorded. I think that, there are folks who have maybe like aunties who definitely organize the local community, but it's not seen necessarily as like, okay, we're going to take this theory and do it this way. But what we're going to do is we're going to feed everybody, and we're going to gather, and we're going to have conversations about what's happening right now in our community, and make sure that we make movement with that, right? So folks have been doing this work, and we just want to be able to bring it and kind of show that as organizations who've been doing this work, and as organizations and people within those organizations who definitely have connections back to communities who are doing this work, there are very real ways that we're able to kind of link this to primary prevention work, and make sure that it's in a way like translatable to the work that folks are looking for us to do in primary prevention work. So I'll hand it off to you, Diana, for this part.
Thank you, Ayana. Again, I'm going to be not going to be in the camera, sorry, because I'm like trying to like look at some of the logistics that are happening in the background. So this way you don't get to see all the paperwork and everything that I have on my desk. So I apologize for that. But thank you, Ayana, for kind of walking us through of, what the history and some definitions. So we wanted to give you sort of like a very basic information before we kind of move into what we believe community organizing could potentially be used as a primary prevention strategy. So before we get into how we do that, I wanted us to revisit a couple of, again, basic definitions that we have talked about in our previous webinar, as well as our Prevention 201 that we had at Worcester with Mark Berger-Naper from the Department of Public Health. So first one is, what is primary prevention? So primary prevention, we know that is stopping sexual violence before it happens. Then second one is risk reduction. So we talked about this on the first webinar that we did with NSVRC. But one way to differentiate primary prevention from risk reduction is to ask ourselves one simple question: who is responsible? So if the responsibility to do something, change or to change something or to avoid something is in the person who could potentially be victimized, then that would be considered risk reduction. If the responsibility is in one of the persons who could potentially be the person that could potentially commit sexual violence, then that we would define that as primary prevention. So now that we have the very basics, let's move into the next slide. So when we were putting this together, we were really trying to think of ways in which us, as well as our member programs and DPH funded programs, could think about the work that you are already being doing, but for you to be able to translate it into CDC language, Department of Public Health approach, and so on and so forth. So one way for us to do that was to do a comparison with a lot of the approaches and the models that the CDC and already has put up for us. So one of them, I'm sure that some of you have seen it, the social ecological model. So we have individual, relationship, community, and society. And when we talk about that one, we wanted to think about a comparison of how that looks like in community organizing, in a community organizing model. So it's just exactly the same, just like different words, right? So we also do it, we want to make sure that community organizing happens on 4 levels, just like within the social ecological model. We want a multifaceted framework. We want community organizing to be interacted in all the levels, to be a more comprehensive approach. So just like in the 4 levels of social ecological model, we have an individual level. So talking about, one-on-one to those who are the key holders or the key important people in those communities that you're working with. When we're talking about the relationship, we're talking about family, we're talking about our friends, we're talking about our community within our church, our community within the school. So we're talking about that relationship. That's exactly the same as the social ecological model. So when we're talking about this, the social perspective is very similar to the community. The only difference is that we put the emphasis on the leadership of the community. Particularly one individual, it doesn't have to be one individual, it could be multiple individuals who take this like social perspective of what the potential problem that you're going to be addressing. Same thing as we do with the social ecological model, we talk about society. This is exactly the same thing as we define it as systems perspective. So when we're thinking about using community organizing as a prevention strategy, we have to think about the systems within those communities. Similar to what we do when we think about the social ecological model, we think about those things. So again, going forward with the same sort of public health approach and with the CDC approach, we want to make sure that we had this sort of comparison and contrast. And as you can see on the bottom, we have sort of like the ways in which community organizing is approached, which looks slightly different to what the public health approach would be. So we already know the problem, right? We already have defined the problem before we even come to the community when we're doing our education and outreach. However, when we're thinking about community organizing, we want the community to be the ones who define the problem. And how are we going to do that? By assessing, by gathering information, and by learning and understanding what the community feels and believes to be the problem. They're the ones who know best the community. So when we do that, we talk with them, we share with them, this is an opportunity for them to share their stories, the impact of the particular problem that they have to find, and we invite them to share those things. So this becomes sort of a very critical point actually for community organizing. This is probably the most difficult to do, and at the same time the most essential, and throughout our community organizing approach. The next one is building, envisioning, propose, and create. The network gathers the community, so you as a community organizing potentially are the one who gathers the members in the community, but then they're the ones who plan the skills that they already have. They already have the knowledge. So they're the ones who use their knowledge and their skills to potentially design and drive the campaign or the actions that they want to do to address the issue that they have to find in your first step. Then we move into acting, amplifying, and making sure that we spread this across all, across the spectrum, right, across everybody. So this is the point where the network or the community engages in different actions that they are the ones who came up with those actions. They're the ones who took leadership on thinking about how this was going to look like in their community. This is very similar to what the work that we do already in our communities. Just this is more led by the community versus us. So when Ayana was giving the definitions of community organizing and the definitions of community outreach and education, many of us actually lean into that to first get into the community. So once we have built that relationship, we can start moving into an approach that will be more organic, and then it will be better for the community for a long-term solution potentially. So again, I wanted it for us to keep sort of the connection with the principles of effective prevention that we have discussed in the past and many of you are aware of. So throughout the following slides, I'm going to be doing a comparison between the effective prevention and effective community organizing using these principles that you see here. So on your left side, again, you're going to be seeing everything that is related to effective prevention. I'm not going to go over that because we have done that in our Prevention 201. But if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in your in the chat box, and Ayana will address those. So we'll be addressing the ones on the right side. So when we're thinking about effective community organizing, we want to be thinking about identifying and understanding the community. we know the communities are not monolithic. So even within those communities, let's say you are already working, so like for example, for me, I used to work in the North Shore. So I usually go back to my community-based programming that I used to do just because it's easier for me to relate it. So there were 27 cities and towns that we used to work with. And of course, we couldn't address all the 27 cities for multiple reasons. So we needed to be strategic about the communities that we were going to work with. And there were many ways in how we thought about what communities we want to work with. But even within those communities, let's just say that we decided to work with all Latino communities. Even within those Latino communities, we knew that there were the Salvadorian community, the Dominican community, the Mexican community, Puerto Rican community. So even within those the Latino community, you had that communities. And even within those sub-communities, you had another sub-community, right? You had women, people that identify as women, people who identify as men, people who identify as children, people who identify within the ages of 14 and 24. So we know that, again, communities are not monolithic. So pay attention again to the historic tensions that could potentially be in those communities. What does that mean for that community to talk about sexual assault and domestic violence? Any historic tensions, intra and interpersonal conflicts, interorganizational conflicts, interdisciplinary differences within those communities. Think about the structure of that community that you're working with. So be really mindful, again, when we're talking about effective prevention, we're talking about a comprehensive analysis. Is the same way when you're doing community organizing. You have to, in order for you to be effective, you have to be comprehensive on how you assess your community. Questions? Please feel free to put them in there. I'm not looking at your chat box, but I know Ayana is. So the next one, again, on the left side, you're going to see effective prevention. And when we're talking about effective community organizing, we want to think about, yes, different ways of that we're going to be teaching or that we're going to be organizing, but we really want to meet people where they are. We want our process to be as dynamic as we can make them. There's a saying of, if tell me what is in for me and then I will come, right? So when we're talking about community organizing, we want to make sure that it is sustainable and that the community is really buying in, because they're the ones who are creating whatever the programming, or what we will call it programming. They will not necessarily will call it programming, but they will call it, reaching to our communities or working with our communities, or just having conversations with our communities. So be mindful of the words that we're using as well, because I feel like sometimes the language that we use, it doesn't necessarily translate as well with some of the communities that we work with. Okay. So just like we do with effective prevention, we many of us are using curricula that is based on evidence-based, right? That has been researched and that it has been evaluated. We do exactly the same thing when we're talking about community organizing, just in different way. Even when we were putting this together, we felt like we couldn't really talk about this with really honoring what the history is, and really be thinking about who came before us, who are the ones who have been doing this work before we even thought about this. Because I'm sure that we're not the first people who thought, oh my God, this would be a great idea, community organizing as prevention. Yay. No, we were not the first ones who thought about this. So I'm sure that the communities that you are going to come and do education and outreach, they have been doing that work. They don't necessarily call it prevention. So again, be mindful of that. I think that's my only point around that. This is, I think, probably one of the most important key principles of effective community organizing. We call it positive relationships and effective prevention, but when we're doing community organizing, we think about building really a community. We're really thinking about collaborations. We're thinking about those non-traditional partners, right? So we're used to like coming to like meetings and we like have our business cards out. So what does that historically mean for people to have someone to, you know, potentially come and show their business card? So the way that we show up physically or whatever, right? So the non-traditional partnership looks a little bit different for community organizing. So one of the things that you really have to be strategic about is know who are the decision makers in that community. And how you're going to do that by really, you know, the people who has, and I put it on quotes, authority, right? Or who are the critical actors? Who are those who hold potential power or are influential in those communities? Those are the people that you really need to get a hold of and really build those non-traditional partnerships, because they're the ones who are potentially going to be driving whatever the organizing or the mobilizing that you are hoping to do in that community. The next one is in prevention, in effective prevention, we talk about appropriately, you know, think about the time that you're coming and doing education and outreach. When we're talking about effective community organizing, we want to make sure that we escalate the process only when it's needed. What does that mean, right? So for us, we believe that we as potential organizers, we only intervened when we find that is the right moment and the right place to do that. Again, because the communities are the ones who lead and who drive this strategy. So ultimately the way for you to achieve that is to be mindful of that when you're going to intervene, where you're going to be taking a leadership, and when you're really going to be stepping back. So that's kind of what it's talking about. And another thing that, you know, when we were doing research, we found is that many times community organizing is being used as unfortunately as a way to potentially create conflict within the community. So be mindful of what is happening in the community when you're doing your assessment, what is happening historically, what tensions are happening in that community. So these things are not happening. How are we doing on time? We're good? Okay, thanks. So where am I? Okay, sorry. Okay, so the next one is in effective prevention, we talk about social culturally relevant, right? To be mindful that not one of the curriculums or the programming that we are using that is socially culturally relevant to the community that we're working with. When we're doing community organizing, before we even think about what curricula, again, we're going to be working with, we have to really listen to the community. We have to focus on sharing goals and share ownership. So what does that mean? Again, I don't know if you have heard, but there's like a saying, It's like nobody's going to come to the meeting unless they have a reason to come. I already kind of said that, but this one sort of reiterates the same sort of like meaning of it, right? You have to interpret the issue as related to them. If we talk about, if we like provide like a bunch of different statistics about what sexual assault and domestic violence, the impacts of sexual assault and domestic violence are in those communities, that may not necessarily be relevant to them, particularly nationally, but if we focus on that community, what that has meant in that community. So when you're doing your assessment and learning about the community, what are the statistics in that particular community? So there may have been like sexual assault or domestic violence that you know about. So some ways of getting some statistics is calling your local police department and getting information about that. If it's the school that you're working with, maybe they're calling you because there's an incident that just happened and they want to bring you to kind of, you know, readdress that issue. So get the information and interpret that issue related to them. Put a human face on the problem. So many of us have kind of moved away from really, you know, not centering survivors necessarily in the work that we do, because we have, many of us have believed that we have professionalized a lot of the work that we do, right? By not necessarily kind of putting ourselves behind the scenes, even though many of us identify as survivors, we may be putting ourselves behind the scenes and not really feeling that we feel either safe or whatever the reason is. So when we're talking about like putting a human face in the problem, is people like to see that people in their community, their friends, their family, they want to see that this is impacting them particularly. I know this may sound horrible for some of us and be like, well, this could be triggering and traumatic for some people, and that is real. It is true. And there is also ways in which you could still have the human face to the problem without, you know, addressing the risk of that the survivor or you could potentially, or the audience could potentially have. So be mindful of that. Again, centering the leadership development and organizing the most impacted. So who are the most impacted in those communities? Who are the ones who we want to be mindful about centering them through the community organizing that we're doing. So throughout this whole thing, it sounds like very organic. It sounds like, oh, this is possible to do it. It takes time, and we've talked about this at the Primary Prevention 201. Prevention is probably one of the longest way to see potential impact in your community. It doesn't mean that it's not effective, right? It just means that it takes longer to do. But we all want to evaluate it, right? There is ways to evaluate community organizing. I've actually have been asked multiple times by like, whoa, how do I evaluate effective community organizing? So just like you do with effective prevention or a lot of the prevention strategies that you are currently using, you have to be very specific by what community you're working with. And the more specific you make your community, the better for you to evaluate that community. Make sure that you, when you're thinking about your community organizing and you know, you think about achievable goals. Like there's many of us that are like, oh, ending violence within the next generation. Is that achievable? Maybe, maybe not. So be mindful of what those goals that you're setting for those communities are. They're actually going to be achievable, just like we do with any other prevention strategy. And you also have to create and measure indicators. And how you do that, you do it with, you could measure and create indicators for leadership development. So when you're working with the communities that you're developing or building capacity, you can definitely measure that. Does that person knew how to, how many people did they bring the first time? Then the second time that you all gather the meeting. There's ways of measuring those things. So again, if you need more specifics, we can definitely, for the sake of time, we can get into the specifics. But if you need more support around how to develop an evaluation tool for community organizing, please reach out to us. We can definitely support you on that. So I was talking about capacity building already. When we do community organizing, we want to build capacity. We want to develop the power of the community. We want to increase the collective power of the community. So we should not be the ones who hold the knowledge of the work that we're doing. I mean, ultimately, I would love for me to, at some point, to for them to be the ones who take ownership of it. So how you do that, be intentional about, again, increasing that collective knowledge and that collective power. They may not be able to go to school and get the master's in social worker or whatever, but you have the capacity and the tools that they already have. Is just a way of finding ways to empower for them to use those skills and tools. So I know I've been just throwing all this at you. So now I'm gonna turn my camera on and see if I can control the camera and the rest of the stuff. Hi. So any questions? Any questions? So we have provided some resources that we've used to put this together. And, for us, it was a pretty big process for us to be thinking about how it was a big idea of how can we use community organizing as a prevention strategy. So it was a big idea. And, I'm happy to hear any of your feedback. What are your thoughts? How can we build more concrete strategies? I'm totally happy to hear your thoughts, questions.
So we have a question. Are there any resources on community organizing within refugee and immigrant communities?
Yeah. Yeah. You want to go for it?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. So two of the resources that we posted in there are actually resources that were made by communities of color, immigrants and refugees, Asian communities particularly, just to be more specific. So yes, definitely. We really wanted to make sure that everything that we were gathering, all the information that we were gathering, was really centering communities at the margins. So what that meant, immigrants, refugees, communities of color. So definitely. And I can send them to you, CHH.
Yeah, and I think just adding on to that too, so the organization that we really looked to was API GBV. They used to be called API DV, I think, or APIIDV, Asian Pacific Islander Institute of Domestic Violence was what it was. And so that's really the document that we look to a lot when creating this presentation. They have a lot of community-specific examples where they did case studies on really awesome ways that folks have organized within refugee and immigrant communities and have done it with a gender-based violence lens. So that's a really great resource to look at. And also some of these resources that we might have to look to may not necessarily be the most traditional ways of finding them, right? Sometimes they might be stories that folks have told in their families that have come down, and people have learned oh, this is how my family used to organize before. And so there might be a lot of different ways where it's storytelling, or whether it's asking community members of that community what kind of organizing they've done before, because oftentimes the resources are scarce in terms of what has been actually put down on paper and accessible like on the interwebs, right?
Yeah. There was another questions about what are your strategies in reaching out to religious communities?
Yeah. Do you want to take this one or do you want me to take it?
Go ahead, and if I could add too as well.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I think in terms of religious communities, it really depends, right? When I was working at a community-based organization, I worked at Asian Task Force Against Domestic Violence, and I was doing their outreach and education. And when we were trying to reach out to the Chinese American community and the Chinese community that was specifically within churches, what we had to do when we were reaching out to religious communities was kind of like just go through the fold of like contacting almost anyone that we could who could potentially be an ally in that. And we found some folks who were really willing to host us and like help us kind of create programming that would be able to reach everybody within that religious community. Also, sometimes it has looked like us having to go door to door. We went to, like, for example, like some mosques to be able to do outreach to them and to talk to them and engage with them. And myself and some like women of color who worked with ATASK who have been a part of the Muslim community were able to come out with me and do like door-to-door outreach and kind of be just like, hey, we're here to talk to y'all. Like, can we sit down, have some tea and talk about these issues, right? And so each religious community looks a little bit different. And sometimes it's just like trial and error, right? And trying to figure out how best to be able to strategize around that.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to some of the principles that we talked about of who are the key, who are the key people, who are the key leaders in that community. Mm-hmm. So in a lot of like religious communities, we know that they're either pastors or rabbis, they're like the key people that the community listens to. So reach out to them. And again, you have to make it relevant to them. So a lot of us, I know I've worked with religious communities in the past, like for us, like coming in at front and be like, oh, let's talk about sexual assault and domestic violence. For a lot of them, it's going to be like, whoa, yeah, I don't think so. Mm-hmm. So try to do your research about what is relevant to that community. What are they working on? Is it public safety? What does that look, public safety? Mm-hmm. So really you have to be a little bit more, what is the word that I'm looking for? You have to be, yes. Yeah. When you're thinking about how you're going to work with those communities, mm-hmm. You have to make it very individual, very relational, like very, very much like, again, hitting all the four, like community organizing, social ecological model, mm-hmm. and to be that is important to them. So I know that we're running out of time, so it's like 2:02. If you have any more questions, please feel free to send them. I want to be mindful of everybody's time. Thank you so much for joining us, and please join us on January 10th, is that right? Evaluation 101. Yes. And we will send you also the our evaluation for today's webinar. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.